Hello, and welcome to the fifth webinar of a series on the topic Roadway Designer for Power Geopack. This webinar will focus on the steps necessary in order to successfully create a transition between two unique templates in the same corridor. My name is Kathy Kassar with MDOT Engineering Support Services. The final two webinars in this series on Roadway Designer will cover intersections and gores and creating surfaces and plotted cross-sections. By now, you should all be familiar with what you should know in order to work with Roadway Designer, so we won't spend any time here. See the previous webinars on the proposed template series and the earlier ones of the Roadway Designer series for more information. Again, you should also be familiar with what you should have in order to work with Roadway Designer and our template libraries. See the previous webinars for more information as well. Alright, so template transitions. So what I'd like you to understand is this, of course, is just one approach to a transition. Roadway Designer can handle a number of different approaches to transitions. One, of course, could be using a super template that uses display rules to handle everything, or one that uses lots of parametric constraints that are also possible as a solution, as well as the method we're going to cover in this webinar. What is necessary to remember is that not every solution is the best fit for all cases, and each one requires a bit of setup and forethought. Some methods course more than others. The point of this webinar is to provide yet another tool in the toolbox to deal with transitions. We have covered display rules and parametric constraints already. However, this idea of transitioning between two templates is just another way to approach changing project conditions. Once there are two unique templates created and assigned to a corridor, it's necessary to help Roadway Designer understand how to connect the dots, so to speak, between the various points on the templates. This simplified example will go through how to transition between two templates with two different curb types. Typically, this particular transition would take place over a 10-foot distance. So we're going to go over the following steps listed to set that transition up and verify that it is working correctly. As mentioned, this example is going to walk through the changing curb type on the project. We're going to go from a type F curb to a type D curb. The remainder of the template layers and materials are the same. This type of template transition would be common where the speed changes or maybe a guardrail would need to be introduced, for example. Using multiple templates can greatly simplify the templates built for a project. However, it requires a very rigid, consistent assignment of point names and a clear understanding of how the various elements need to be connected together. Override names for both points and components remain an essential part of building a good connected model, regardless of one super template or many individual specific templates. So we're going to pop right out into Power Geopack and run through these steps and the example. First thing we're going to do is look in the template library and look at the two unique templates. They're not very different from each other. As I said, we're just going to be talking about the different curb types. So this is the curb transition template 1 and curb transition type 2 here. And again, if we go into them a little bit closer, what you're going to see is the biggest difference is going to be that this is an F curb. And it's got the F curb configuration. And then under type 2, again, it is very similar, and it is using instead the D curb. And again, this is something we would see if we were just going to be changing speed, or maybe we needed to put a guardrail section in with a D curb. And this is one way to handle it. You'll see there's no display rules, there's nothing hidden in this template. It is exactly as you see it. And this is one method of approaching changing project conditions. Some people may not want to deal with many different display rules or what they consider to be a super template. They would rather draw each section as it comes up and then simply add them all into Roadway Designer on the template drops as they are needed, and then they'll have to transition between them. The challenges with that are related to the point names, and you must be very, very specific with the point names that you've assigned at the various layers. If you're not, what will happen is Roadway Designer will make assumptions for you on how those points need to be connected from one template to the next, and you could end up with components that are not rectangles and in rectangular shape, I should say, and they become kind of spaghetti. They'll twist around, and this point in the center could end up connected to a point on the end. It uses those point numbers, the point names themselves, as a guide, a first initial guide as to how to connect the dots as it goes through and process the model. So if you're not careful with how you do your naming convention, you could end up with looks like spaghetti. It could be, just a giant mess of points crossing over each other and not creating very good subsurface layers, which could then cause you problems when you try to do your earthwork calculations and cut your final cross sections. So if you're going to do this approach and use multiple different templates, I highly recommend that you pick one. You start with a base template of your pavement layer that is the same, and then what you'll do is you'll use that as a base for any time you build a new template, and that way you're sure to get the same point names, at least for the middle part, the meat of your template, and then you'll have to use your override names as you get on the outside. Now at this point I have not assigned any override names to the back of curb situations. You'll see they're all white. All right, now ideally, in order to create a good connected 3D model, I would have to come in here and connect these with their override names. I'm not going to go through that. We've done that in previous templates. But in this case, in this example, if I were to go ahead and model this, there would be breaks in my 3D line strings because I did not, at this point, go through and do any override names. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to show you how you would drop in multiple templates. But just to keep that in mind is if you were going to do this approach, you would want to make sure that you've assigned your override names to these points so that they know how to connect together in a 3D model. Okay, so we're in the Roadway Designer file at this point, and what I've done is I've created a corridor for the template transitions, and this is just something for us to use to kind of look at the various ways of doing a transition. And then what I've done also is come into the template drops, and we've placed the templates. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is when you do multiple template drops, it's very, very important that you start with your first template, and I've started with the F curve. And then where I'm going to end that F curve and begin my next transition, okay, you need to place another template drop. A lot of people make a mistake and they put template 1 and then template 2 right after each other, maybe 200-300 feet, 400 feet, 1,000 feet away from each other. And what the program then wants to do is try and transition the two templates across that entire distance that's separating. And that's not what you actually want. What you want to do is control where the transition is actually taking place between two templates. So if you can think about a 2-lane to a 4-lane and you had one template that was a 2-lane and the next template that was a 4-lane, you would have to drop the 2-lane twice. Okay, once at the beginning of the project, once where that 2-lane transition to 4-lane begins, and then you need to drop the 4-lane transition where it begins, and then you would go on and so on. So it's very, very important that you make sure you do these drops. I want you to pay attention to as well that I'm doing a 10-foot transition between curb type F and curb type D. Okay, so because of that, I'm doing my template drop interval at 5 feet, or half of the distance in which I'm going to be processing this transition. What this does is it will guarantee that I get at least one intermittent processing point in the midst of this transition, okay? So you want to make sure that you have allowed that extra point in there at least. So if you're going to be doing a 100-foot or 250-foot transition between a 2-lane and a 4-lane roadway, then you want to make sure that you at least allow some, a 10-foot drop or something in there so you get some intermittent template drops. But this is especially important on a short transition such as this, which is only 10 feet. So you'll notice here too that the enable transition checkbox has come on. What this means is that we actually want the template to try and connect the dots between the points. This is not a shear face change from one template to another, which of course you could have if you were changing from a shoulder section to a curb section. You wouldn't necessarily want to try and transition those points, those 3D model points. You would want a shear transition. However, in this case, I'm transitioning between two different curb types. I want to make sure that my back of curb, my face of curb, my gutter pans, my bottom of curb, all those points begin to blend together. And that's what it means by enable transition. Okay, so in this case, again, we're going to come back out again and do another 10-foot transition and from one curb type D to curb type, and then I will, of course, change that to 5 feet as well, so that we get that additional transition point, okay? So this is the type of setup that you would need if you're going to be having multiple template drops. You want to be able to create those transition locations and identify when you're going to be actually doing the transitions and not a shear drop. Okay, so we're going to close that. And what that does here is you'll see that it adds in these orange lines. And these orange line tells you every time there's a template drop, it will drop one of these orange perpendicular lines across the alignment. Now, you'll notice here too that it is yellow. All right, this is an indicator that there is a template transitioning occurring here, okay, but has not yet been defined on how that transition needs to occur. Okay, so it's giving you some color indicators of what's exactly going on here. Now, if I were to come back out to template drops, and I'm going to really quickly turn off the enable, and you'll see that what has happened is now that it's become not filled. It's a hollow box. This tells you that there is two different templates going on here, but that you have not identified that you would like to transition the points between those two templates. So this is something you would see more in a shear phase. So if you've got a long stretch of these boxes where you've got, you know, like an orange line, orange line, and it's all yellow in between, you've made the mistake in your template drops of not identifying where the stop and start of that transition actually needs to occur. All right, so once we have these different template drops, then we need to go ahead and tell the software how we want to do the transition, and we need to edit those. So you can get that a couple ways. One, I can double click here on the yellow box and it will open up this edit transition box. Another way to go about it is to do an end condition exception, and again you can identify where that's going to happen. I could say I want that to happen here at 350 and then there again at 360, and then this is going to be a left or a right transition. Okay, so then you would identify and add that transition and then edit, and you get this box, which is very similar to the one that we were just looking at. Okay, there's two different ways to approach it. I prefer to come in and double click this box, and what that does is it jumps me right into the transition, and you'll see you have these dark red points that don't know how they're supposed to connect with each other. Okay, that's how we know that those transitions are not, right now they don't know how to talk to each other. And I'm going to move the template, and you'll see that the points, because my point names are the same from one template to the other, the only thing that's different is the curb points, that these lines are all connected to the appropriate location. See, I don't have any crossing points. You'll see they're even slightly different in depth going on here. Based on that bottom depth is slightly different, so you'll see how it's transitioning across those bottoms with those orange lines right there. I'm going to drop this one right here. You'll see those orange lines, which tells me that there's a different depth for the material. All right, so what we need to do is then you need to click on this red line, or this red crosshair here, and then we need to tell it where does this connect to this template across the way, and that of course is this point. So we'll make that connection, and then similarly here I'm going to tell this point that this should be connected across to this point. All right, when I do that, just by left clicking on the various points, you'll see that all of my bold crosshairs are all gone, and that tells me that all the template points are in fact connected to something on the other template. Okay, so that's a very clear indicator of whether or not you're missing any points that need to have some type of an understanding of how they belong and connect to the template adjacent to it. All right, so once we've assigned those connection points, click OK, and you'll get a message here that you need to tell the transitions how they're going to, sometimes you need to remove some constraints in order for those transitions to work. So then you come into the Edit Transition dialog. Now what this slider bar does is that this is what it looks like in the middle of the transition. If I left click and slide it, what happens is that you're seeing right now that nothing is really moving except for these points at the end, which are daylighting points. And that's because the constraints currently assigned to this template don't know how to move. So we're going to double click on this point, and right now it's set with a vertical constraint, and I'm going to turn that to none. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing to the inside here and set my vertical constraint to none. All right, by doing that, now if I move the slider bar, we'll see the curb line begin to grow and shrink. So what you need to then do, that's how you handle this transition, is you need to allow the curb to grow and shrink. So you have to remove the constraint that is inhibiting that movement. So in the case of if you were widening your pavement, you would have to remove the horizontal constraint within that transition so that it knows how to stretch the pavement section from a 2-lane to a 4-lane, or in the case of some of these things in respect to depth. All right, you have to watch that, and you'll see that this is what's going on here, and that's based on some of the other constraints, that there's even the ag base, or the underneath the curb line, is moving around a bit based on the constraints that are happening there. So we might want to have to pay attention to that, but we're going to focus on the upper part of the curb right now. And you'll see that, of course, that curb height is growing and shrinking. All right. Again, we're only affecting the transition. That's what I'd like you to keep in mind here, is that we are affecting the transition only. So that's just one way. Again, we're only affecting, as I said, the transition section. We are not affecting the rest of the template. Okay, so now we see that the template transition has turned blue, which tells us that we've assigned a particular transition. Not that transition is good, not that it's bad, but we have assigned one. All right, so you can see here in the upper window that at 350, you can see how the curb is going to push out, because we're dealing with a slightly wider face and back location on these two curbs. So we went from something more narrow to something wider, and you can see how that reflected here in the line work. All right, so we're going to go ahead and scroll up to the next one. And again, we see that it doesn't quite know what to do in the midst of the transition. So we need to correct that. We need to help it out. And again, if we double click that, we can then connect the dots between this point and this one, again, and this one and the one up on top. And then, of course, we need to come through and make our changes. So we'll have to go through here and then, of course, remove this vertical requirement to none, and same here for the face of this, because this is the one that controls, and then we change these now. Once we have our adjustments made, you'll see that the template, of course, does grow and shrink as it should, as the other one does. Now, if I come back out and power through, you'll see that it, of course, makes that change, and you can see the template then, the lines here of our curb lines come back in and narrow back. All right, as I said, this is a fairly simplistic view of template transitions. Again, to keep in mind, it really, really is critical that if you're going to do multiple template drops, that you make sure that you add in your template transitions. Again, double the stations or double the template up, so you can see that this is this template holds for that entire station range, and then at this point we're going to do a transition. And then coming back out, it is very similar. All right, this is a very key element to using multiple transitions, especially if you're going to be doing any type of manipulating or modifying of the templates to meld them together, so to speak, to change one from one thing to another, from one curb type to another, from one thickness to another, between two templates. Again, you'll notice, as I said, when we did the transition, that it already had a lot of these connected together correctly, and that was because my naming convention helped that out. All right, so I'm going to show you really quick, if you use a barrier wall right now, what happens if you don't have that template naming convention very similar, or we haven't done that. So we're going to look at that really quick so you can understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I've done is just created a really quick corridor we're going to call it barrier test, and I've dropped in the double-faced barriers from our current template library. Now these need some work, so this is a great example for me to show you what happens if you're not careful with your naming convention. So what we've got here is the two different type, or the double-faced section AA, what it's just a regular barrier wall, transitioning into the B section, or the BB section, which is slightly wider. So this is when we're approaching a bridge section, and then into type C, or section CC in our standard plan, that has the sidewalk and the sand section in it. All right, now this is just a good example to show you what happens if you're not careful with the way that the points are named within your template. Okay, so we're going to take a look at what's going on in these various transitions. In this first one, again, because the one is just wider and one was made from the other, you'll see that it already connected the dots between the various templates, and they're very similar. Again, so to make this grow and stretch, we need to remove the constraints. So that the barrier wall should be able to adjust in width, and you probably aren't going to see much of it in this particular scenario because they are so similar to each other. So then we get into the second transition, and this is what I mean by you kind of get spaghetti. Because of the way that the point names were set up within the various two template components of the barrier wall, it's trying to match up like names with like names, right? This is definitely not something that you want to see in your template, and you don't want to have to do this with your templates every time you run into a transition, especially if you decide this is the better way to go for you. Again, not all cases work with all different types of situations that we can use in Roadway Designer. Some people like the super template. Some people would prefer to use parametrics and use one template and stretch everything, enter a long list of parametrics. There are some people that may prefer very simple templates with no display rules, no parametrics, and they drop in each template at every location where something changes. That's a very legitimate method of modeling. It's old school kind of, but it does work. But again, you don't want to have to go through each one of those template drops and have to clean up something like this every time you come through. And of course, it can be cleaned up, but it does take a bit of time. I would have to come in and delete all of the connection lines. This is just right-clicking and deleting all these lines, and then begin to modify my connections. I know this point goes to, would go to here. I want this one to transition to the center maybe. This one would come from the center. You would have to kind of see how this would play out in the model. If these are in fact the points you want, then what do you do, with the bottom of the sidewalk? How do those be? How are those? Are they just strictly coming in at that point? Do they somehow blend with another point? You kind of have to go through and play with these connections and see how they will in fact work. So you would come in and basically left click and connect your dots across your template. So this can get time consuming if you're doing this for every time you're making template drops. So that's why I highly recommend that if you're going to go this route and do multiple transitions on your project, that you are very rigid and very specific in the names that you employ in your template drops. Okay, so that you make sure, then you can see here that it's stretching and shrinking. And it might not be quite how you would want that to work. So you'll have to play with those various points and connections. I would probably want it to stop about there, quite honestly, so that maybe you don't connect this point. Maybe we would delete this one and delete this one, and instead connect it to the outer points as opposed to the inner point. And then if we see how that works, maybe that's how slightly better. See, it's still going to overlap. So it really does depend again on how you want your transitions to work. And again, those point names really do become important on how that works. So we can see the different transitions occurring within the template. And this is just sitting on the alignment, so it's not something that would be specific. So you can see how it would go. And of course, you get slightly different look to the transition box. which tells you there are some points that are assigned, but not everything. You still have some points that it doesn't quite know what you want to do with. And these are just, again, visual clues on what's happening in the transition. In this case, maybe you don't want those points to transition. You want them just to show up here. And you see the difference. At this template drop, I have the sidewalk. And we don't see that sidewalk when it's widening. We get into the middle here, and we see that there's no sidewalk. It's beginning to widen, but has yet to actually appear until that location. And that's the difference in the way that that transition works. Okay, so any point that has not been assigned a blend point or a connection, and maybe that's the way to handle that overlap, is we'll delete those connections. Okay, and then we won't get that. Maybe we won't get, maybe we need to do the same thing on the bottom. We'll delete these 2 points too as well. Hit OK. Some strange. Let's see what that does. We'll see how it looks here. Looks like it's losing the middle point. So again, you have to play with the transitions and see what really would matter and how they would come into play. Connect those to the outside. There isn't always a clean solution in the way that those cross sections are going to work and what we're looking for. So this is, again, just an example. I want you to kind of understand what I was talking about by spaghetti if you're not careful with your point names. Sometimes you have to add extra points in the first template so that you can make those connections cleaner. If it does something like this is going on and you don't like how that transition would look in the midst of a cross section, that's not how you maybe want to see it. Maybe you need to come up with a slightly different extra points in the first template so that you have something to connect your points from the next template that you're going to be transitioning to. You'll see at this point I'm picked up my sand and my barrier, and at this point I had none. So it's that middle transition that's occurring that those points are using, and that's why, again, we have this light blue color, because not everything has been assigned. Okay, so and again, if you're talking about a shear change, this is maybe something that you want within your particular template transitions. So something to keep in mind if this may be a better way that maybe you want to go about doing your models. So this is just one other option. Okay, so hopefully this provided a good look at the steps required to transition between 2 different templates. Again, keep in mind that while this is somewhat a simple example, the principles applied here are the same for any type of template transition between 2 unique templates that you're going to see in Roadway Designer. This concludes the webinar part 5 of the Roadway Designer series. Thank you.